The year was 1905, in the mystical port city of Varna, on the shores of the Black Sea. It was the type of stormy, rain-swept evening that made it less than desirable to venture outside. The type of night that made a person grateful to be able to huddle by the comfort of a warm hearth. A professional orchestra was just finishing a tour of the region, and Varna was to be their final performance on this very evening. Needless to say, all of the members of the orchestra were weary and ready to go home to their families. The conditions of the evening made it even worse to have to play this last show, knowing that no one in their right mind would venture out in this weather to see them perform. The conductor pleaded with the owner of the theater to allow them to cancel this final performance. If they were allowed to cancel, they could still make the last vessel leaving out of the port of Varna, sailing for Sevastopol that very evening. The tired, homesick musicians wanted nothing more than to get back to their families at that point. But the theater owner had different plans. Their contract clearly stated that should one person be in the audience, just one, they would have to fulfill their obligation and play. The tired and disgusted orchestra grudgingly loaded their instruments and equipment into horse-drawn carriages as they made their way through the dark streets and treacherous weather to the theater. Upon arriving and unloading, the theater appeared to be completely empty. Maybe they would be able to cancel and head home yet. Sitting in the middle of the theater, completely alone, was one man. He sat attentively looking at the stage while they set up with a gentle smile on his face. The conductor again pleaded with the owner, saying, "How could we be expected to play for only one man?" But the owner still wouldn't budge. Reluctantly, they all set up and got ready for this final performance. This sole person was the reason that they weren't going to be sailing home to their families that night. Home would have to wait. At this point, the orchestra collectively decided to give that single man the performance of a lifetime. They played to that one man like they were playing to a packed house, with as much heart and emotion as they could muster. All the while, the man sat attentively until the performance was complete. The exhausted performers waited, but there was nothing. Complete silence from this lone stranger. Completely disgusted at this point, the performers started to mumble among themselves about the disrespect of this man. A worker at the theater finally decided to check on the sole audience member. To everyone's horror, it became apparent what had happened. The man was no longer among the living. They had played a whole symphony for a dead man. The shocked and distraught orchestra members packed their instruments and belongings back up and left the theater. Some turned in for the night, but most struggled to understand what had just happened. How could they not have known? Why did this happen? Did their exhaustion and self-pity blind them to the situation? Eventually, they all went back to their rooms and fell asleep to the rain hitting their windows. Morning came and people started to stir in the streets. The weather had cleared by this point, and in the brisk early morning sun, word of a tragedy was starting to spread through the populace. In the poor conditions of the stormy Black Sea, a vessel had sunk. The very vessel, in fact, that was supposed to be transporting the members of that orchestra back home to Sevastopol. As fate would have it, the presence of this lone, deceased concertgoer had saved the lives of the whole orchestra from a watery grave. As the horrific news began to sink in to the members of the orchestra, their attention turned again to the man who had saved their lives. After inquiring, they were told that the man had no identification on him, and no one seemed to know who he was or where he had come from. No one knows what forces of the universe lined up to create this profoundly odd situation. Was it God? Was it luck? Was it just a plain twist of fate? Whatever it was, one thing is for certain. That unknown man saved those people who ended up going home to their families. Their lives went on and they had children, who went on to have children, who had children, who had children. Their descendants are still walking among us today, none of whom would have ever existed had it not been for that unknown man whose earthly shell enjoyed a most wonderful symphony.